It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with Professor Daniel Matt, who's one of the world's leading authorities on Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, has been featured in Time magazine, appeared on National Public Radio, and the History Channel, has published over a dozen books. I recently had the pleasure of reading God and the Big Bang, which we're going to have another recording for, so stay tuned. The Essential Kabbalah is a wonderful place to start to learn what Jewish mysticism has to offer. And he just completed about a year ago an 18-year-long project with the first scholarly translation with critical manuscripts of the Zohar, which is often considered the foundational text of Jewish mysticism. It was explained that it was a monumental contribution to the history of Jewish thought. Taught for many years at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, where he still lives today. So thanks for taking this time.
Good to be here with you.
So let me ask you, where in your life journey, in your intellectual quest, what was it that led you ultimately to have this fascination with Kabbalah and to devote almost 2 decades of your life to translating the Zohar?
Well, I'm sure it goes back to being a rabbi's son. My father
Most people run the other way, but
yeah. Well, I wrestled with that. My dad was a rabbi, and I felt a genuine spirituality from him. I remember sitting with him Shabbat morning davening and just feeling a closeness to him, and probably that was combined with the beauty of parts of the davening. I remember just lines like, Hashamayim Mesaparim Kodel, the heavens declare the glory of God. And I just felt a ruchniut, a spiritual energy in him. He didn't promote Hasidism or Kabbalah. He didn't try to instill Jewish mysticism in me. I don't remember him using the word mysticism. In fact, he was somewhat skeptical of mysticism because he wanted to keep a gap between God and the human being, between God and the world. But I felt the spiritual energy in him, and I think that drew me to look for that element within Jewish teaching. I remember being attracted to the writings of Martin Buber in my late teenage years, and then looked at Hasidic stories and then Hasidic texts. And Hasidic texts would often quote the Zohar. Just a phrase, a word, a line, never more than a line or two, but always something very juicy and powerful in a kind of lyrical Aramaic. I knew a little bit of Aramaic then and could make sense of it, but it really made me want to explore Zohar. Yeah. And my junior year abroad in Jerusalem, I was at Hebrew University for my junior year abroad, and that's where I began studying. Remember, I took beginning Zohar and advanced Zohar at the same time.
Really?
And I was lost in advanced Zohar, but that didn't matter because I was also lost in beginning Zohar. But that gave me a year to really plunge into it. And then I returned to Brandeis and finished my undergraduate degree and did a PhD in Kabbalah. And that's really how my interest developed.
What was your experience like with Gershom Sholem?
I got to know Sholem a little bit. Nachum Glatzer, who was a fine teacher at Brandeis, invited Sholem to come to Boston for one semester to teach at Boston University, and I got to be a teaching assistant for him. So trying to translate Sholem's academic lectures to undergraduates at BU, at Boston University. And I would go in for office hours and just figure out any question I could so that I could sit at the feet of the master. And it was a real thrill to be with a person who really made the Kabbalah accessible to the West. He was a towering figure, but also something of a character and a jokester. And that made me realize I could study Zohar and not totally surrender my personality.
Beautiful. What was your experience like translating the Zohar? What aspects did you find personally meaningful in that work, and what did you find particularly difficult?
Well, it's a book of lyrical writing. The Zohar is really two things at once. It's a commentary on the Torah, but it's also really an experiment in medieval fiction. I say that because it's stories of rabbis wandering through the Galilee, running into strange characters on the road. A little boy who makes fun of the rabbis, or an old donkey driver who seems to be a total idiot, but ends up being a great sage in disguise. So part of the message is you don't know where you're going to find wisdom. Don't dismiss anyone. Don't dismiss any situation, because there may be a gem of teaching there. So that surprise element in the Zohar really appealed to me. Its lyrical beauty, its surprise, its fictional framework, and its radical teachings about God, really, a new way to approach theology. I think the Zohar is dissatisfied with the traditional view of someone up there running the show, and it really reimagines God as the energy animating the cosmos. And that spoke to me at a very deep level because I had my own questions and problems with traditional God language, traditional theology. So I saw the mystics as wrestling with God and trying to make God real in their lives. The difficulty is that the Zohar is intentionally cryptic. The Zohar doesn't come out and tell you what it's saying. It really wants the reader to wrestle with the text and to figure out the radical theological possibilities herself or himself. The Zohar is Aramaic, and the Zohar is written in Aramaic, but a very bizarre Aramaic. The author of most of the Zohar is this figure, Moses de Leon, and he's living in Spain in the 13th century. No one spoke Aramaic in his circle, but he's writing it in Aramaic, perhaps partly to make it look ancient. The Zohar presents itself as ancient wisdom, as going back to the 2nd century, but it's really written 1100 years later. So the Zohar is intentionally difficult, and that's a real challenge. And you just have to move very slowly through the text, and you have to ask yourself constantly, what does it mean? But it's really through asking what the Zohar means, you're exploring your own inner psyche. The Zohar really makes you explore yourself as you're exploring the text, because it's talking about the nature of God and what's the relationship between God and the human being, the human soul. So you can't really figure it out unless you're involved in your own spiritual search. So the Zohar really, in a very crafty way, draws you into spiritual search. You think you're trying to figure out the meaning of a word, but you can't figure out the word in the context of the passage unless you ask yourself, why am I here? What is God asking of me? So you're back and forth between studying the word and working on your own inner process.
So on that point of spiritual quest, if someone doesn't consider themselves a full believer in whatever sense, but they're agnostic, it seems that this enterprise of devekut, of piously trying to cling towards God, is so central. Is that a barrier? Would you say to someone that it's a spiritually worthy project to study your 9-volume translation, if they are more in an agnostic place?
I think the Zohar. The Zohar loves questioning. You could say that's really one of the great things of all Jewish teaching, of Midrash and of Hasidic rabbis, and going back to Abraham, questioning and challenging God. So the Zohar is challenging our current theology. The Zohar is dissatisfied with that picture of God seated up in heaven running the show. It presents an alternative to that, which really does allow you a lot of leeway, a lot of room for imagination. For example, the ultimate reality of God is really beyond all the names that we know. The only name that's adequate for God, according to Kabbalah, is Ein Sof, right? The infinite or infinity. So ultimately, God is infinity. So if you believe that there is something called infinity, then you're already in the realm of the Zohar's view of God. And even maybe a more radical name than Ein Sof is Ayin, spelled with an Aleph. Aleph Yud Nun. God is nothingness.
I've tried to explain this a number of times. Maybe you can unpack what that concept means for a moment.
To say that God is nothing is very challenging. Now,
and to try to emulate that also to become Ayin, right?
To become Ayin would be right. To turn the Ani, Aleph Nun Yud, to turn the ego into Aleph Yud Nun, into nothing. For the ego to dissolve into the divine oneness. That's really the ultimate goal in all mysticism, East and West. And in Kabbalah, it takes on this name Ayin. So what does it mean to call God nothing? This doesn't mean that God does not exist. Rather, it is saying God is no thing. God cannot be identified with any one thing. God animates everything, but you can't put God in a box.
Is this like in a Maimonidean sense, a negative theology?
It's really learning from Maimonides. It's really the Zohar, even though, in a simplistic way, you could say Maimonides is the rationalist, the Zohar, the mystics. How could the two ever get along? But the Kabbalists grow up on Maimonides. So they learn from Maimonides that you shouldn't say what God is, you should say what God is not.
Yeah.
And they take that to the extreme of saying God is not this or not that, God is no thing.
Mm-hmm.
So saying God is nothing really draws from Maimonides.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fascinating thing. Maimonides' great book of philosophy, of course, The Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides wrote that in Arabic, but it was translated into Hebrew already during Maimonides' lifetime, and then it caused a great controversy because Jews in Europe could read it. But it's interesting, the oldest copy in the world of the Hebrew translation of the Guide is in a library in Moscow, and it's dated the year 1264. At the end of the manuscript, the scribe says, I wrote this copy of the Guide for Moshe ben Shem Tov de Leon.
Wow.
For Moses de Leon.
Wow.
So the oldest copy of the greatest book of Maimonides was written for the author of the Zohar.
Yeah.
And he grew up on that and learned from it, and then he departs. Maimonides would turn over in his grave to see some of the teachings of the Kabbalah about the Sefirot, about the union of the masculine and feminine,
the problem of intermediaries
within God. Yeah. But in terms of the ultimate reality of God, what Kabbalah says is really in line with Maimonides.
Uh-huh. So you've already started to touch on this, but what do you think the Zohar has uniquely to offer people today who's searching for spirituality? What is uniquely meaningful or relevant that they might be able to access there?
I could point to three things.
Okay.
One is what we've just talked about, that ultimately God is beyond all names.
Yeah.
That the only term that really accurately depicts God is infinity, and Sof. But if we're going to talk about God, the Zohar insists that we balance the masculine with the feminine. And that's a very important corrective, because all Western religion is so dominantly male, so dominantly patriarchal. And Mary Daly, the feminist, once said, as long as God is male, the male is God.
Right. Yes.
So unless we revise our vision of God, we're not going to achieve social equality and gender equality. So the Zohar insists God is equally masculine and feminine. And of course, the feminine half of God is known as Shekhinah. That word is not invented by the Kabbalah, but the Zohar really takes it and runs with it. And you could say the main character in the Zohar is the Shekhinah.
But is this a big barrier to moving to post-essentialism?
What do you mean?
In the sense of that human beings have a determined essence, and that males and females have a determined essence. Chesed and Gevura are distinctly male and female. I mean, how in a postmodern sense, in a neo-Kabbalistic sense, could Zohar still be relevant in that way?
Yeah, I think, we could learn from Jung. Carl Jung really says every man has a hidden feminine part within him. Every woman a hidden masculine part. So the thing is to become fully who you can be, not to be boxed into one predetermined. The third element, so infinity and masculine and feminine, but the third, maybe most intriguing, is the Zohar teaches that God needs us. So God is somehow incomplete without our active participation.
Theurgy.
Theurgy, that we have an effect on God, that you could say we actualize the divine in the world. It's a beautiful name for the Shekhinah. One Kabbalist calls the Shekhinah Sod HaEfshar, the secret of the possible. So you could say God is potentially here. God's potentially in the world or potentially in our lives, but unless we cultivate an ethical, spiritual lifestyle, God remains unactualized and incomplete.
Beautiful. So my last question for you. Some have suggested that there are strands of Kabbalah that are antinomian. They reject Jewish law. Or not just particularly Jewish law, but the legal enterprise itself. Do we see that in the Zohar?
I mean, the Zohar certainly insists on observance of mitzvot. Really, every mitzvah is an aphrodisiac for the divine romance. So the divine male and female should unite, but they can't unite, they can't consummate their union unless they're stimulated by human action. So in that sense, mitzvot are vital, and without mitzvot, God remains incomplete. In that sense, the Zohar is nomian. But later heretical movements, the most famous, of course, is Shabtai Tzvi, they quoted certain things in the Zohar which could be interpreted in an antinomian way. To give one example, in a very famous passage, the Zohar says that when we read the Torah, we shouldn't stop at the outer layer. The outer layer is the narrative. That's just the garment. Then you come to the body, and the body is the mitzvot. But deeper than the mitzvot is the soul of the Torah. And the soul of the Torah, turns out, is your direct contact with God. So God's presence is there in the Torah. Don't stop at the outer layer of the narrative. Don't even be content with the mitzvot.
Mm-hmm.
You should peer beneath the mitzvah to the teeming energy of the divine,
Yeah.
which is inhabiting the text. So if you read that leave aside the outer layer and leave aside even the body, you could conclude from that we should focus only on the experience of God and not be too fascinated by the mitzvot.
Yeah.
It's not really how the Zohar is saying it, but later readers took it that way,
Right.
and Shabtai Tzvi in particular.
I know some later scholars who become uncomfortable with korbanot and by shlishi, say animal sacrifices in the third temple, say, well, interpret those just on the level of remez and sod. Like, this will just be deeper mystical interpretations, philosophical interpretations. And you could imagine that once you start interpreting text on the level of philosophically or mystically, that you might lose interest in Pshat, in some of the more literal reads.
Yes.
But what I hear you saying is that there was also still a commitment to maintaining.
Yeah, that takes us back to the famous rabbinic principle, I'm sure you know, En mikra yotzei midei pshuto, that a text can never escape its pshat. In other words, you should create midrash. Yeah. Midrash is vital, but don't let the midrash replace the pshat.
Yeah.
You could say that's the Zohar's view, but on korbanot, on sacrifices specifically, the Zohar is very bothered by Maimonides' relativizing of the korbanot. Maimonides, says that the korbanot were just God's concession to Israel's slave mentality. And the Zohar says, no, the korbanot are vital, and the secret of the korbanot is important. Yeah. So you could conclude from that we still need korbanot. Whereas Maimonides wants to move in an evolutionary way to a pure.
Even though he contradicts it in the Mishnah Torah, which is its own issue. Anyways, the 9 translations, the 9 volumes are going to be read for centuries to come. Do form a group. Consider forming a group in your community to learn this together. Incredibly rich. And if you haven't read The Essential Kabbalah, please consider doing that as well. Professor Matt, thank you so much. Such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Yeah.